Okay, I've realized I've forgotten to record. Um, Hi everyone. Welcome to the final structure of argument structure series. I am deeply, massively regretful I missed out the first parts of the introduction and other things. But TLDR, welcome to the final series of the arguments workshop. Um, my name is Imran. I will not bother introducing myself. You all know who I am. Um, Whatever Yugi's introduction was, it's always in my heart, as he said in his workshop. So, aha. Okay, so I will be giving a workshop on arguments. This is beginner tailored, but it's also aimed to help anyone of any skill factor. So if you have been debating for quite a while, which I know some of you have, this will still be very helpful to you in some capacity, especially the later parts. So, there are five things. The first is the structure of the argument. Um, the second is the advanced argument principles, slightly. Third is coming up with the right argument. Fourth is some tips on delivering arguments, and then five is the Q&A. There are two caveats here. The first is that this workshop assumes you know what an argument already is, and you know what debating already is. I will not go in depth to explain what is an argument because I think everyone here should probably know what an argument is already. It is the claim that you forward in a debate. It is the foundation of every debate ever. The second is that this is going to be a workshop about the argument idea in itself. So I will not be covering the specifics of an opening half argument and a closing half extension, but this workshop is still relevant to when you give an extension and when you give a top half argument. There are some differences I'm aware of, but perhaps this can go later in Q&A if you're interested in figuring and asking me how you want to execute these steps. So the first part is structure. This one is the most easiest to understand and the most basic part of an argument. So the TLDR of structure is that there actually is no set agreed upon rule on what the most correct argument structure is. People say different premises, people say layers, conclusions, impacts, they throw out all these words and stuff like that. All of these are fine. I actually have no problem with that. Um, every single speaker, especially if you speak first, especially if you knew, usually employ different argument structures, including myself. I literally never use the same argument structure consistently. So a first speaker like Asan, probably like if you know Asan, he's like the goat of Malaysian debating, probably has a much different first speaker structure than me, and I probably have a very much different speaker structure than Atifa from IIU and was also a very goated speaker. And the reason for that is because arguments aim to just simply accomplish a goal, which is to explain why you ought propose or oppose the motion. And there's nothing really in the world's manual that says that you should follow a specific argument structure. The only real thing is just to forward persuasive reasons and content to why we ought support or oppose the motion. So there's no such thing as a correct argument structure. So even before this workshop, if you're going to MNIDC or if you're starting your debate career, um, don't feel pressured to be thinking, I don't really know what the best argument structure is because it's a very personal step. Because debating is a very it is a sport of expression where a lot of your personality really comes to shine, and that often shapes the different structure of speech you can give. So, for example, I have ADHD, and I am joked around to have to suspectedly have autism. So a lot of my speeches tend to be very hyper fixated rants about something, and I tend to like go into very heavy detail, forgetting things about time efficiency and things like that. Um, but there are other speakers who are very meticulous and structured, and they have like very simple, very, very technical steps of explanation and structure. There are some speakers who are very storytelling like, and they don't focus much on structure and rather focus on trying to tell a specific message and convey that. Um, the point I'm trying to make here is kind of clear, right? Like, I think it just kind of depends on what you like. Regardless of this, even though there is no correct detail on what correct argument structure is, all arguments are made up of three fundamental levers. No matter how different your style is, it'll always come down to these three things. The first is claim, the second is analysis, and the third is impact. And if you're debating in as a novice, you can often get away with debating with these three steps right away. The claim is simple. It's just a title. I think a claim is necessary in no matter what structure you do, because you simply need to just communicate to the judge what is your argument. What is the title of your argument? What does it aim to achieve? That's the claim, by the way, right? Analysis is most likely the bulkiest part and the most complicated part of argument. And analysis has like a very like if you conceptualize a graph, right? Like the level of advanced analysis you can go is something that never ends. Like even at the highest level, analysis continues to evolve, and there are different and theories and structures of analysis that we will not really get into because that's not where we are headed towards. And finally is the impact. Um, of course, there are still other parts in an argument that you may think of that are still important. Imran, what about weighing? Imran, what about being comparative? Imran, what about premises? Yeah, that's correct. You can still add that in. But I think a premise or a comparative is still part of analysis because analysis is simply the foundational baseline of persuasion. Why is how or how is something true? So when you explain what a premise is, that's part of trying to prove the argument to be true. When you're being comparative and you're comparing both sides, that in of itself is the work to explain why your side is better, which is also boils down to what analysis fundamentally should be, which is an explanation of why this argument is true. Impact and weighing kind of go hand in hand because that's just explaining why it is important. So these three fundamental steps form the basis of every argument ever. And if you listen to any speaker's first speech, you'll often come to realize and are able to point out where the claim, analysis, and impact is, even if they have different questions and different structures they're asking. And even if you're a novice, I'd say you can get away with debating by simply using the structure. Let's give a very simple example of a very simple motion. This house for bad smoking. The claim is very simple. Smoking is bad because it harms people. Analysis, there are three reasons. Firstly, there's direct health risks. Second, there's second-hand risk. Thirdly, there's addiction. Then there are three impacts. First, on the individual, you have lower life expectancy, lower quality of life. Second, on community, it burdens healthcare, it reduces productivity, you lose money. Thirdly, it's morally harmful. You can run that unfair to harm others who don't consent to smoking. That's a very simple argument structure, and honestly, not that deep. And you can get away with everything. So let's just throw a completely random example of a motion right now. Let's say the motion is this house supports this house supports this house supports being a debater. And the claim is being a debater helps with your critical thinking. Analysis. One, debating debating impromptu forces you to think on the spot and think of multiple levers. Second, debating empowers you and pushes you to learn more about the world through research to knowledge. Thirdly, the act of debating forces you to be adaptable, think on your feet, and learn how to speak, etc. Impact. Number one, you become smarter. Number two, you become more knowledgeable. Number three, something, good impact. There we go. I have just on the spot made an argument of a random motion using the three-pronged structure. Where is this structure useful? Everywhere. Honestly, even advanced debaters still use this. Like, even at the very top level, you'll have people who are saying, first argument, 4 reasons why this is true. Here's the impact. And that's it. And I think the reason it's just simple and effective is because this is just the most understandable form of a structure in argument. And if you don't really know where to start, you can just start using this. You don't need to overcomplicate the process of making an argument. Okay, now we go a little bit into advanced argument principles. Okay. So there are two principles I want to bring about here. And I want to flag here, I think this is where the workshop goes beyond the basic levers of what we think about arguments and more into what I hope are very helpful, important tips when it comes to the idea of constructing an argument. Sorry about that. Okay, firstly, an even better structure. So I know I mentioned claim analysis impact is a good structure, and it still is. However, sometimes when you evolve as a speaker, you notice that speakers also evolve argument structures. To caveat what I mentioned before, there is no such thing as a correct set argument structure. Here is what I have typically used and what I see other speakers use a lot. The idea of advanced argument structure simply involves the use of combining multiple arguments into one broad case. So we are going beyond claim analysis impact. Now we are thinking about each argument having different sub-claims or different sub-arguments or layers or burdens, because each part aims to answer a specific question necessary for the full logic chain of that argument to work. Let's see an example. And this is my favorite ABP motion ever. This house would legalize child labor. Do not cancel me. This is ABP 2024 round 1. Let's say the main claim is child labor is unironically good for the economy when it is legalized. Perhaps it is a bit intimidating to use the claim analysis impact structure here because, maybe for a lack of a better word, you might need to prove a specific complicated logic chain for the main claim to be true. So instead, what I've done is I've broken the big chunk of the claim into separate sub-arguments that are interlinked with one another in order to prove the end conclusion. So you'll see what I mean when we get into the depths of each step. So step 1 of this argument, or burden 1, or the first layer, or the first part, whatever you want to call it, it's all correct. Why does legalization make a meaningful difference compared to the status quo? 4 reasons. Firstly, it reduces employer risk because now firms openly scale up hiring when it is legal. Second, it creates enforceable state-protected contracts because kids have workers' rights. Third, it brings child labor into the tax net. Now you can collect revenue under child labor. Hilarious. Fourth, there's more visibility and regulation, which incentivizes safer and more stable hiring, which is better than unsurveilled illegal hiring and money that's gone lost. Step 2. Why does legalization lead to a safer yet more efficient form of child labor? The first is that now you have basic safety laws that, i.e., no 14-hour shifts, basic equipment standards, which reduce workplace harm. Reducing workplace harm obviously improves worker productivity. Second, formalization improves training because firms invest a little in teaching tasks to children because they want these child laborers to stick around to make them more productive and make sure that they're continuously working. Third, you have competition amongst firms for legal workers, which pushes wages slightly up, which reduces worst case exploitation. And finally, you have child family worker unions, where families of child laborers, because children can't consent, technically can't consent and make informed choices. So families are now heavily involved in the decision-making process of children. So you have child family unions to lobby for workers' conditions for children, which then leads to better conditions for children. And all of this makes child labor safer, which implicitly also proves that child labor is going to be good for the economy. That leads to the third step. Why does this lead to economically productive child labor? The first is that you expand the labor pool just by virtue of it being legal. You have more workers, you have higher total output in labor-intensive industries like farming and textiles. Second, it cuts costs for workers because you can just pay lower wages to kids. And it would be fine, which means you're able to sell cheaper goods and make goods cheaper, stronger competitiveness in export markets. Third, you attract FDI because investors and MNCs prefer predictable, legalized environments. So, for example, Nike kind of does do very sus child labor stuff, but if you legalize it, then other shoe company who didn't really want to compete with Nike in a sus country would kind of come in, and Nike's like, okay, maybe we shouldn't exploit our kids because now it's legal, so we can do this fine. Fourth, it generates taxes. Nom 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 nom. Governments can use that to invest into infrastructure, health, and even education. So it creates a positive feedback loop. And finally, short-term poverty relief because families just get income because their kiddos are working, which stimulates local consumption and small businesses. Obvious impacts: you improve the lives of child laborers and families. You escape illegal jobs to save legal jobs because child labor is going to happen either way. The comparative is that it's illegal, and now that we legalize it, it's now legal. So you don't have to go to the illegal job to make money. You can just go to the legal job. Families escape poverty because they just make money. You have less reliance on predatory lenders or predatory informal sectors. Economies also just get a stronger base of productivity because they have a larger workforce, they have more FDI, taxes increase state capacity. So, what I've done here, essentially, is I have basically converted the structure of an argument from what we conceptualize as claim analysis impact by separating what we think about analysis into levers or basically like links that prove the impact. Um, the reason this is very good and important to use and something that would very helpful because number one, arguments, especially in debating, will typically have high impacts. What does it mean to have a high impact? It means that so a high impact claim is one that is the economy gets improved. That is a high impact claim because you can't just say like very small levels of analysis to prove that the economy will get better. That will not win you debates. What would win you debates is by identifying logic chains or questions you ought to answer in order to prove why the end outcome of the economy getting better is something that you achieve. So what I've done here is to think about what are the necessary steps I need to prove in logical order to prove why is it that we get better outcomes for the economy. And this applies in every single motion, in every single argument. So um, to come up with another example off the top of my head, let's say the motion is something amongst the lines of let's go back to this house supports debating. Step one is to explain, I think, why is it that when you enter into debating, you are much more likely to be in a healthier and encouraging environment of developing your critical thinking. So you can say things like debating gives you communities which often challenge you through spars and encourage you to be better to coaching. Debating in tournaments allow you to debate a variety of motions and lead to other communities. Second step, why does this process of learning overall make you even better debater in person? Firstly, because your knowledge base increases and your thinking about debating increases, which expand your brain into going into other sides. Second, you unlock more networks and communities. You unlock more resources as being the more you enter into debating. Since you have higher potential to get higher quality kinds of feedback, join higher quality forms of tournaments, partner with higher quality people, and develop yourself even more. And you can impact that with what I said before. So, of course, it definitely varies from each motion. Not every argument has 3 steps. Sometimes an argument can just have 2 steps. Sometimes an argument just has 1 step to prove. And therefore, you don't really need to go beyond the depths to prove why is it that, um, steps can go into different ways. I think Asan calls these premises. I think other people call these burdens. A lot of Malaysian debaters call these layers. All of these things are basically the same thing. You are just identifying and splitting apart your argument into different parts, different layers, different premises to prove the end outcome more rigorously. So that is advanced tip number one. How do you think about argumentation in a more advanced structure? Step two, integrate framing and setup. So the novice trap I found that I literally just recently discovered as I was coaching my other kids who I think are also in this meeting. Yes, is that they'll often tell me, Imran, I do so much framing and then I lose my time for my argument. I think, how do I improve, huh? And then the problem is that it's not that your framing and setup is wrong to do. Setup, framing, characterization, all this stuff is a good thing to do. I want to caveat this crucially that these are. I think someone is unmuted. Okay, they have been muted. So the caveat here is that setup framing is good and important to run. It is execution that is the problem that leads to those problems of time efficiency. Like because you're not giving your arguments because you're spending too much time on framing. The easy trick to fix this is to integrate framing and characterization into your argument. And the reason this is also important is because just now we talked about how there are different steps or layers to your arguments you want to prove to make up a cohesive logic chain to lead to the end outcome of your argument. Framing and characterization might become the basis of the steps you want to prove. So let's do another example. Let's say the motion is this house believes that nationalism is on Moham the Good. I'd be like 3 pieces of framing, and I spent 3 minutes in these framings. And I have 2 arguments to give, I need to give them in 4 minutes. That is dangerous. I'm getting a 75 because you spent too much time on framing. But here's the thing. How do I reconcile this? Because my framing is still important, right? Like I still need to describe what is nationalism. I need to explain why nationalism is powerful. I need to explain how does nationalism form. Like how do we surpass and overcome this hurdle? That is very simple. You integrate all that into your argument. Let's say you want to use these structures and you want to use them into the argument. The claim is that nationality structurally drives inclusion into conflict. This argument has three internal frames. Then you can also logically explain how it leads to harms or how it proves a outcome to occur. So, what is nationalism? It's an ideology that builds pride in one's nation. Because its logic is very comparative, i.e., it compares uh, a group that belongs into a group that doesn't belong. It always creates an outgroup, and then you can prove here why is it that this force of nationalism is very powerful, which is, by the way, internal framing number 2. It motivates self-sacrifice and pride by appealing to a higher collective cause, which was effective in anti-colonial struggle, but this is also the reason why you make irrational choices. And the reason this is powerful is through how it forms, because it forms as a unifying tool against an enemy. After independence, once thy enemy disappears, unity collapses. Because post-independence, you have different ethnic, tribal, or regional groups that have different interests that are no longer united by nationalism in the long term. So notice how within the argument, even though I really haven't given analysis here yet, like I haven't given much analysis, I haven't proven why XYZ thinks is true, I haven't proven why why is it likely that nationalism leads to harms? Why is it likely that nationalism is interpreted in a bad way? How do nationalism give powerful? I have integrated what was the framing I wanted to give in the start of my speech into the argument, and this is good because it builds up what I wanted to say in the argument anyways. So I think internal framing and characterization is super useful, and I would encourage you all to step out of the bubble of a first speaker of being like, I need to give framing and set up all the time, and this needs to last 3 minutes. No, you don't have to give 3 minutes framing. You can give framing. You just need to execute it in a different line, that is more efficient for your speech, especially if you are noticing that you are running out of time a lot. If your time efficiency is not good. Of course, this then leads to the question, when should you use internal framing and external framing? External framing is still good in situations such as A, there's highly definitional motions, where you need to explain what the heck the motion means before anything else. Or there are metric debates, where you need to explain what is the way judges should decide this debate, off the top of the bat. So what is the moral metric we use to decide between utilitarianism and deontology? And finally, when you are anticipating definitional fights. So for example, debates about developing countries often get bogged down in no one agreeing what the correct context of a developing country is, what the correct context of XYZ step is. So it's important to use framing, because framing, of course, narrows down the scope of the debate into an area you want to fight in. That is where framing externally is much more important. Basically, the TLDR is use external framing if you feel like there's going to be a struggle in where the motion takes place or how we interpret the motion. That's what framing is all about, right? It's about explaining why the motion operates in a specific lens or operates in a specific group, or framing is explaining why the motion should be about a specific thing. If you feel like you have to establish this above anything else because it makes every part of your case relevant, then you do external framing. And here's the thing, you can do external and internal framing at the same time. There's no such thing as a binary. External framing is good for establishing the grounds. Internal framing is good for asking the characterization questions or the framing questions that help your argument. Now we go into when internal is good. Internal is great if you want time efficiency. Instead of spending 3 minutes on framing, you spend 1 minute on framing. 1 minute of framing is done for necessary external framing, which is establishing the scope of the debate before going into what the argument stuff. Second, where the definition or the framing stuff is interlinked into making the argument work. If you are able to simultaneously define, so for example, the motion is techno-optimism. If you simultaneously define techno-optimism, whilst explaining how the definition leads to the harm in your arguments, you have killed 2 birds with 1 stone. Very helpful. It's interlinked to making the argument work, basically. So, basically, if framing is directly leading to your argument working out, then you should try to use internal framing in your argument. Certainly, if it enhances the argument. E.g., going back to the child labor thing, child labor legalization improves economies because formalization changes incentives in a good way, which come from our characterization on why formalization is done in a good way. The characterization is immediately baked into the logic link of how child labor liberalization improves economies because formalization changes incentives, because of our characterization. So the framing enhances the argument because it's improving the logical rigor of the argument, basically. Again, I want to point out and clarify very explicitly. I wish I wrote it here, but I'm gonna say it for you to drill down into your notes and heads. Internal and external framing can be used at the same time. There is no such thing as a binary. It is in your eyes and it is your what do you say, responsibility to determine how you ought execute internal and external in a way that is strategic for your speech. So we use internal more when you expect that you don't need to externally place the debate somewhere where the motion is very clear and you can kind of just do some work to do some very specific framing to enhance the argument. So, for example, I have a good example of how I use internal framing in a motion where I want to switch the change. So the motion is this house predicts the fall of Western liberal democracies in the near future. Let's say opening half goes into this debate about the practical, i.e., Western liberal democracies will fall because democracies are going liberal. Let's say I want to run an extension that operates on a completely different framing of the round. But I start with my extension. The first extension I'm going to explain is a different manner of how the fall of liberalism is something that is very relevant in this motion. And the frame for this argument is this is not a debate about the fall of democracy or not. This is a debate about the fall of the principles of liberalisms. What is liberalism and what is it defined by? After I've defined liberalism, which is the internal frame of my argument, now I get into the actual analysis. Why is it that right now we are expecting the fall of liberals' principles, and why is this something you should care about in the argument? That there is essentially the idea or the basis of how you can use strategic internal framing in terms of making your argument work. You can still even do that externally. Maybe your external framing is explaining what liberal democracy is all about. The point I'm trying to make here is experiment, think about what works, think about what doesn't. There's no set rule on what works or what doesn't. It is a case-to-case basis. It has many variables. It depends on the motion. It depends on how you prefer to speak. It depends on your speaking style, all that stuff. All right. That's honestly the meatiest part of the workshop, actually, those advanced principles. Now we get into step 3, which is coming up with an argument. Let me just drink some water, because I have been yapping a lot. Cools. Okay, so I will be a bit short here, because coming up with a good argument is honestly things that Yugi already mentioned in his previous workshop of case prep. So, and honestly, the idea of coming up with a good argument comes from case prep, because prep is where you come up with the argument. But I will still give some tips on how you can come up with a good argument. The TLDR is round vision. Round vision is essentially the idea of expecting and thinking about how a round is going to play out when you are in a motion. And you do this by asking yourself important questions in prep, like what will the other side say? What is the clash in this debate? What do we need to prove? What are the different parts of this motion? I won't go into the nitty-gritty because again, this is kind of going over the purviews of what this workshop is intended to do. But to briefly kind of like bring this together to ensure that these are helpful tips for you, the idea behind what I'm trying to say here is that you need to be able to visualize how arguments from both sides play out in the round. That's why it's important to prepare and think about what will the other side argue and what will the other side respond to your argument. In BP, this is important because you have two teams who are going to respond to you, and you have two teams who are going to come up with arguments. The best advice I can give to novices when they are prepping in BP and in debating in general is to always think about why your opponents will say against you, not about what you want to say first. Because if you think about what your opponent's going to say against you, you think about how you can defend against that, and then you build your arguments in a more strategic and smart way because you are preempting off the top of the bat in case prep. You see, smart preemption in debating is not saying, here's my preemption to this argument in your speech. That's a novice trap. Preemption is baked just in case prep alone because preemption is all about expecting what they're going to say against your argument and dealing with it right off the bat. That strengthens your analysis. And this doesn't just improve the strength of your argument, it goes around into thinking about what the correct argument of the debate is going to be. If you know what the clash of the debate is going to be, if you know what you need to prove, then you're always going to be able to come up with slightly higher quality arguments in the round. Again, case prep covers heavily to this already in terms of breaking down emotions and having different case prep strategies to think out the correct arguments. But this is like an overall purview of what that entails. Finally, delivery. This one is also short. I have 4 tips I just want to point out in delivery. Firstly, have a nice, snazzy, sexy title. Arguments need to be remembered, and judges are human. What do you mean by this? Judges are humans who are expected to listen to a full debate for 1 hour, and all humans have attention spans which vary. Um, you need to make sure your speech isn't boring, and by extension, you need to make sure your argument isn't boring as well. So make the introductions to your argument very snazzy, make the headlines like pretty. Because if you don't make it pretty, then you're not memorable. And you're not memorable, people just psychologically unbiased against you. Second, signposting is the king of good argument delivery. Saying stuff like, there are 3 reasons why this is true. Here are 2 different ways this can happen. There are 2 different impacts. This is the upshot of the argument. All of this just makes your argument much easier to follow. In the sense that you're simply telling the judge right away, how should you follow the argument structure I'm providing to you? Thirdly, word economy is king. Yes, arguments should be the bulk of your speech, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't be efficient. The easy drill for this is to learn how to explain the same argument within a shortened timeline. So if you're arguing for 5 minutes, try to argue within 4, try to argue within 3. This allows you to think about how you can run it better, how you can cut out content. Finally, clarity is more important than speed. If you speak fast, that's not really a problem, but the understandability of words and phrases is much more important than the speed of the wordings that you say. Especially when you are judging in MNIDC, where good speakers in Malaysia are not fast. They are just very good at clarity and very, very good at having clear, strong, rigorous analysis and communicating the strength and importance of their arguments. Like, this is my theory on the top level of Malaysia debating. I don't think we are rappers. We are definitely not rappers in any sense of the word. But we just have godlike riz in terms of debating. Where all the arguments these good debaters are saying are like very clear to understand. They're very obvious as to why they're winning and important. The analysis is structured well, all this stuff. So that is actually the correct way to deliver an argument, in my opinion. If you are speedy, you can still be speedy. Just make sure you don't sacrifice clarity. Alright, that's actually all for the workshop. So it's not as long, which is very different from my previous workshops, but that's a good thing because it means that there's like not a lot of theoretical, hugely big stuff here. So we're gonna get into a Q&A for just about 10 minutes or so, and then we can end the session. So yeah, here you guys can ask questions in the chat. You can unmute whatsoever. You can ask anything related to arguments or anything else. To be honest, I'm very, very happy to answer.
Okay, so I have a question.
Yes, Yugi.
There are issues where in certain instances a judge goes, you should always integrate your responses into your arguments. And some would say, oh, you could have probably had the argument responses earlier, so you've engaged with them, and then go to arguments. Then there's another who says vice versa. What's like a universal way to just appease all of these people?
So the caveat I'll say here is that all judges are different, but I think when judges ask that, what they're virtue signaling onto you is, I want to hear your responses become meaningful in the way I think they should be meaningful. So the universal way of fixing this is to treat your arguments as a response. That's the first advice, to treat your arguments as response. So here's the trap, here's the thing. Internal rebuttal is literally just argumentation, if you really think about it. Because internal rebuttal is aimed to destroy the persuasiveness of another side. But that's also what arguments do. So, for example, if I'm claiming as an op team against a team who says child labor is good, that child labor is likely to be exploitative, that is an argument from me, but it also responds to their framing on why child labor is likely to be good. And I think the way to make this pop out most of the time is to be super clear. Just say one line on saying this specific line I'm proving here responds to this line that they are saying. Because when you're doing that, I think that's where you truly appeal to everyone. You appeal to the internal rebuttal guy who is like, internal rebuttal, yay! But you also somewhat appeal to the external rebuttal guy because the external rebuttal guy is mostly just kind of harping on you onto structure, but they just want to see how you are explicitly responding to their side. So you just make it clear to them that this part of the argument is responding to that part of the argument. I'm doing two things at once. I'm arguing from my side, but this argument also destroys their side. Then they would also be appeased. And even if you talk about appeasing them, it's just very helpful for you because you're also being efficient with argumentation because you are doing, again, two things at once. You're responding, but you're also arguing. So that's advice number one on just like internal rebuttal is just an argument, and your argument should be flagged as response. Either way, it appeals to both sides. The second step is something I have advised a lot recently is weighing as a response. Um, so people often forget that responses are just a form of weighing as well. So because weighing is just explaining why your argument should be more important and why the argument is less important. And it is a universal form of response because you're directly comparing the truth values or the values of a different argument. So it appeals to the external guy because the external guy may be a little bit disappointed that you didn't do external rebuttal. But now you have done external work to explain this argument beats them. So it's a different form of response because you're not saying their side is wrong, poo poo pee pee. You're saying our side is wrong, you have been mocked. And you're also appealing to the internal rebuttal guy because part of what makes internal rebuttal valuable to the guy who likes internal rebuttal is the idea of the value of your case and how it directly beats their case implicitly. Weighing just makes that step more explicit. And weighing is not saying magnitude or scale. It is simply saying you should care about this argument more because it isn't just about appealing to a large amount of people. This directly flips the harm that they explain and explains why they have a larger harm on their side of the house that is more certain, and that's why you should credit us above them. That's a form of weighing that's very persuasive and still appeals to both sides. So TLDR, number one, flag out very clearly your rebuttal, no matter where you put it. Even in your argument, it should be very, very flagged out that it's a response. Second, weighing is key. It often is the easy way out as well. I hope that answered your question, Yugi. Yeah, I'll take that as a resounding yes. Bentany says, how do I stop myself from over-explaining and being repetitive in my analysis? Tip number one is the third step here. Word economy, the best way to drill yourself to make sure you're not being repetitive is to simply drill yourself into making an argument, making the same argument, but forcing yourself to say it at a slower time. So if you notice that your average argument delivery time is 4 minutes, you try to deliver that same argument in 3 minutes. And then you do that repeatedly until you're satisfied with the quality. And then after you're satisfied with the quality, you try to deliver it in 2 minutes 30. And then you do that again. So this is a drill, obviously. It helps outside of the actual debate itself. But this is super helpful regardless because you're training your brain and you're training yourself to deliver things in ways which are important. The second way is mostly advice on case prepping. The reason repetitiveness and over-explaining often happens is because we often try to recycle analysis for everything. This is, I think, so this isn't really circular analysis. Actually, no, it is circular analysis. So circular analysis is the concept of saying the same thing in different words and thinking that it is contributing to the debate. A good note of advice here is before you give your speech, while you are case prepping, look through your notes and think about if the things you are saying is either A, utilizing the same line of reasoning just in different words, or B, depending on a specific premise for everything to be true. So let's say like for example, a specific harm is predicated on proving that developing countries are bad. So whenever you give your three reasons, you're saying because developing countries are bad, they will do these things. Because developing countries are bad, they will do those things. Because developing countries are bad, they will do these things. Why don't you just say, here's why developing countries are bad. There are three impacts that occur when developing countries are bad. That just saves your life easy, but also adds the level of breadth in your analysis. So that helps you from being repetitive. To stop you from over explaining, I think the easy way around this is to think about how is it that you can stop yourself from like why is it that people think you're over explaining? It's because you're taking too much time to explain a point that can easily be understood in 3 seconds. The good way to think about this is shorthand and saying things like very short headlines is often still good enough. I think it's important to build a sense of discipline when you're explaining analysis, or when you're explaining the argument structures or the parts of the argument in a way that is short and concise, whilst not removing the sacrifice or the part of the argument. So, for example, I think it is more efficient to just say, instead of going into a very long, rounded explanation as to why developing countries are bad, you just say developing countries are bad in four particular lights. The first is this, the second is this, the third is this, and the fourth is this. Instead of going into a 2 minute rant about why developing countries are bad, that is, I think, how you try to A, prevent yourself from being repetitive, but also B, help yourself from stop over explaining. How should we do a vertical extension in a desperate attempt to make it more appealing and persuasive to the judge so that you're not flagged as derivative? So, um, I think I think the problem with like the idea of desperation in vertical extensions is that if you're running a vertical extension in a desperate attempt, it is very difficult to pull off. There are some strategies to mitigate the risk of a fourth. The first is that you need to be explicit in admitting that your opening had some pretty good mechanisms and they prove some pretty important burdens. The first step is admitting your failures, basically. You need to understand and think about the fact that your judge is crediting your top half already. So something I do when I do CG whip, when I do closing whips, is I will go and I just straight up say, so our opening was kind of cool actually. They proved these three burdens quite well. And that's the first step. The second step is to respond to that actually. So here's the thing. The easiest way to weigh an extension against your top half that is vertical is to think about the automatic responses to what your top half is saying. And essentially, you're trying to figure out how you fill in the hole. Because by responding to your own top half, you're figuring out their weaknesses. And by figuring out their weaknesses, you come up with ways to enter in the debate with your extension. That's how you make it more appealing and persuasive. So, this is what we call communicating the entry point. And the entry point doesn't even have to be a weakness in terms of the fact that they missed something. It could be just a perspective that you think that is valuable to the debate that they did not cover explicitly, or they covered to some lengths but did not go into the deep lens into it. The third, and this is very important, that's something a lot of people don't figure out, is to, when you're weighing, you need to compare what you are saying against what they're saying, and why what you are saying as a more nuanced level to the debate. So the idea of persuading the judge that you are not flagged as derivative is simply to communicate the uniqueness and nuance of your mechanisms if you compare them side to side with another team. I.e., you're trying to explicitly say, opening government gives this mechanism to why. So let's say, for example, opening government, let's say the motion is this house would ban celebrity court trials. Opening government gives this mechanism to explain that celebrity court trials are likely sensationalized and therefore develop a sense of misinformation because it's very easy to create sensationalist celebrity stories that are not representative of the trial. And this is all predicated on the fact that people don't really watch these trials, they just watch the celebrities react to this trial. What our extension aims to do is concede that people watch these trials anyways, but that media has incentive to appeal to, since the media channels have incentive to create the worst forms of framing and agendas, a framing of the trial in a way that reinforces bad beliefs or bad views. So for example, celebrity trials that involved a high profile divorce settlement or a high profile lawsuit in terms of defamation after a divorce. I will not name who I'm referencing here. Uh, implicitly flags a specific victim and a specific hero as a suspect, which also entrenches certain harmful norms that create harmful impressions, which do things like lead to possible worse precedents, such like victim blaming. This impact is more long running and deep rooted in the debate because opening government is contingent on you believing that people will always opt into sensationalist headlines without listening to the actual celebrity trial. We explain that it occurs regardless of whether or not you listen to celebrity trials because these patriarchal norms and media the incentives of the media aim for it to do it this way. That's like a way I communicate it. Right. Any tips on feeling stupid and completely everything I've learned when I start the speech? Um, look at I think it all's about your notes actually. What you say in your notes is supposed your notes are your guidelines. So if you look at your notes, and you give yourself like headlines, then it's important for you to refer to those. The second thing is before I give a speech, right, I always write at the top of my speech strategy. The strategy is like, okay, Imran, do this, and then do this, and then do this, and then remember to say this. It's kind of like a cheat sheet. Write a cheat sheet that basically is you need you to refer to before you give the thing. Okay. Is there any other questions? I can entertain like 2 to 3 more if there's anything else. Okay. So I think elaboration comes into 2 ways. The first is macro elaboration, and the second is micro elaboration. Macro elaboration is everything I've said in the advanced steps. So different steps for your argument. This is good elaboration because you're splitting the argument into different steps. Internal framing is also integrating steps to set up. So I think just remember these things that helps with macro elaboration. I think the tip, I think what I understand what you're probably referring to is micro elaboration, which is the actual way of elaborating a specific piece of analysis in a way that is more longer and nuanced as opposed to stopping head on. Um, yeah, so I understand this is a easy thing that novices struggle from, which is how can advanced debaters have like larger depths of this analysis and stuff like that, but not me. So, sorry, give me a second. I think someone is calling me. Just give me a second. Okay, yeah. So how do you improve micro elaboration? I think the first advice I give here is that micro elaboration is often, or elaborating things well, is often done by understanding the small logic chains in each part of your analysis. So, most good pieces of analysis is simply saying X happens. When X happens, this leads to Y. When Y happens, this leads to Z. So, for example, in this specific step here, the first reason is that this expands the labor pool. Expanding the labor pool happens when you have more workers, and because more workers happen when you have more children in the workforce because they're legal child laborers. And when you have more children who are working in the workforce, that means you have higher total output in labor intensive industries. The easiest way to fix strengthening the elaboration you can make when you're giving your analysis is to always think about it in a way of you are explaining the judge the causal link of how A leads to B, how B leads to C, and so on and so forth. Um, Simple chains of logic is mostly just A leads to B, and then you're done there. More often, it's not always the case. My second tip is to integrate illustration and examples. So, illustration and examples within argumentation aims to essentially provide the judge a very visceral viewpoint or a understanding of how a thing looks like. Um, this is an addition to your elaboration that strengthens the quality of your analysis because you're explaining the how does this look like to your judge. So that's something that's really helpful. in terms of sin. Finally, you can make up for the lack of elaboration by the quantity of reasons you give. Um, so if you feel like you're not really sure how to like have a huge depth and breadth of explanation to one thing, you can come up with multiple chains of reasonings like what I've done here, and it often just makes up for it because they're just like hearing that there are four reasons why something is true. Actually, that depends on the kind of judge, but most of the time they will value you having a multitude of reasons to prove one specific claim. I hope that addresses the question. All right. Anything else, guys? Yeah, I'll like give 2 more minutes. Maybe let your brains marinate and think about what questions you want to ask. Okay. Um, that is nice. I will. I think that I hope that means that the workshop was very clear and good for everyone. I hope. Okay, so I'm gonna formally end the workshop here. So yeah, so I hope this gives you guys a good idea of argumentation. Um, so of course I didn't go too in detail into things like improving the quality of your analysis and all, but I think the more important part about it is understanding the basic philosophies and structures of an argument first before you get into those nitty-gritty steps, like how to prove things better. And I think as a novice, it's very crucial to understand execution of arguments first before anything else, and then you can slowly develop your journey of how to get better with analysis. Because getting better with analysis and impacting and strategic argument thinking, the core baseline of that is knowing how an argument works first. So if you know how an argument works first, you can develop every other skill in argumentation far better, and then boom, you are in a good line. So, yep, that is all for this argumentation workshop. Thank you to everyone who decided to attend the full workshop series. Of course, thank you to our workshop givers, but most importantly, we really hope that this workshop series, to those who were watching across all four, was very, very helpful in some way possible, whether it be helping your judging or speaking in some way. So yeah, that is all, everyone. Have a great night. Bye bye.